Tales of an Unlikely Brotherhood by mentallypapaya, Chapter 2. The world is my canvas. No, it's not. You just couldn't find any paper. Shut up, Kacchan. Uraraka loved Yue, she really did. She was friends with almost everybody in her class, got to be taught by some of her idols almost every day, and was able to live out her childhood dream of becoming a hero. She could do without the school assemblies, though. Maybe it was a little childish to be so against them, but Uraraka had thought her days of sitting in a large hall filled with students while her teachers and principal talked about the most boring things imaginable for hours on end, well, she thought she'd left those days behind in middle school, is all. But no. Apparently even Yue had mandatory assemblies every now and then. It was just like what she remembered back when she was a kid. All the students shepherded into a massive auditorium and told to get comfy because Nezu would be talking to them about safety for the next few hours. It was fair to say that at least half the hall mentally checked out the second they heard what the assembly was about. Okay, yes, maybe they got attacked a lot, and got into their fair share of trouble, and yes, maybe this year had seen a new height for serious injuries coming from the new heroic students, but that didn't mean they should be subjected to this sort of torture, right? Uraraka shared a tired look with Todoroki as the two of them, along with Ida and Asui, found a place to sit down, the four of them having entered the hall together. We should have a place for Mido to sit. He'll probably come and join us when he comes in, Asui whispered, as the bustle of the other students started to mellow out a bit. Everybody starting to settle down as they waited for the assembly to start. Ida craned his neck towards the entrance before perking up slightly, pointing. There he is. Somebody get his attention. As the last on their row, Uraraka took her job to flag him down, turning to locate him and waving to get his attention. Izuku was standing at the entrance, looking over the sea of people with a slightly nervous face as he clearly scanned every visible person for someone he knew. Uraraka stuck up her hand higher when he didn't notice her, opening her mouth to call out his name, before she faltered when she noticed him sag slightly in relief, and immediately hurry over to somebody on the other side of the large hall. He's going over there. Who's he? She paused in confusion as she finally caught on to who Izuku was making his way towards. Asui furrowed her eyebrows. Who's he going to? He's going to sit with Bakugou. Todoroki realized, eyes following Uraraka's. And the four watching as Izuku fast walked over to the row that indeed had Katsuki sitting on its end with Kirishima, Kaminari, and Sero next to him. He tried to sit next to Bakugou on the couch the other night and got shoved off. Doesn't he have a better chance trying to sit on the stage next to Aizawa-sensei? Asui muttered, gesturing towards the stage where Aizawa, along with the multiple other teachers, were sitting on chairs and looking very much like they wanted to be there just as little as the students did. Uraraka shrugged. Across the room, Izuku finally came up to where Katsuki was sitting, fingering the end of his shirt as he silently stood there, not saying anything. Katsuki noticed the presence and looked up, before rolling his eyes and, to their audience's surprise, silently slid over further in the row, giving Izuku room to sit down. He sat down quickly, looking much less tense, and neither of them seemed to notice the way Katsuki's own friends watched this happen with the same exact level of understanding as Uraraka did. They watched Kirishima lean forward to see Izuku before turning quizzical eyes onto Kaminari, who raised an eyebrow in return. That's not very in character for Bakugou, Asui observed evenly. It is odd, Ida admitted, but maybe he's just starting to recognize the importance of class unity. Asui and Uraraka shared disbelieving looks. Yeah, sure, Ida. They were disrupted by Nezu's voice echoing through the giant room. Their attention was momentarily ripped away from the strange interaction as the assembly finally started. Still, Uraraka couldn't help but be drawn back to her friend, repeatedly throughout the assembly, boredom and curiosity leading her eyes back over to where she knew her classmates were sat, as did the others around her. About 15 minutes into Nezu's spiel, Asui snorted quietly, jerking her head over to where she'd been watching Izuku and Katsuki. "Kero, looks like Mido's even more bored than us. Maybe he should have sat with us." She giggled. Uraraka turned her gaze over to where Katsuki was clearly trying hard to pay attention to the assembly, while Izuku fidgeted restlessly next to him. He was tapping his hand on his knee repeatedly, head whipping around the walls and ceiling as he tried to find something interesting to focus on. Almost seemed to physically will the talk to go by faster. It reminded Uraraka somewhat of a small child waiting desperately to be allowed to go play on the playground, or a dog wagging its tail as it waited for its owner's permission to dive into the food bowl in front of it. He started picking at the skin around his nails, eyes flitting around as he brought his hand up to his mouth to nibble on them, when Uraraka saw Katsuki side-eye him with a tired glance. Distantly, dozens of memories floated into Uraraka's mind, in which both Izuku and other classmates had been victim to that look only moments before a smack to the head or a verbal assault. Instead, both her and Asui watched as Katsuki silently reached out to drag Izuku's nails away from his mouth, seeming to whisper something to him as he did so. Izuku wilted, seeming to look put out as he whispered something back in response. Then Katsuki rolled his eyes in. That couldn't be right, but Uraraka swore she saw fondness in those eyes. As Katsuki reached into his back pocket and brought out a thick red marker, he handed it to Izuku, making a gesture with his arm as he turned back to focus on the stage. Uraraka's first thought was, why did that just happen? Her second was, isn't the pen useless without something to use it on? Her second thought turned rapidly into her third. Oh my god, Midoriya is trying to suicide by cop himself with Bakugou. This was because, upon being handed this marker and having been left to his own devices, Izuku immediately brightened up, uncapping the pen and promptly dragging Katsuki's arm into his lap, where he began to carefully draw on his skin. Is he allowed to do that? Todoroki whispered next to Uraraka, alerting her to the fact that all four of their little group were now watching with fascination as Izuku actually looked like he was getting away with drawing on Katsuki's arm without consequences. The assembly faded into the background as Uraraka blinked to check that what she was seeing was real, but nothing changed when she looked back to the two classmates that she had previously believed couldn't even go 3 minutes without getting into a fight. Not that it had anything to do with Izuku. It was just that Katsuki had never before acted like he thought Izuku was even worthy to be called a person. Yet here he was, silently and calmly allowing the other boy to use his bare skin as a canvas. Just to what? To keep him from getting bored during a school assembly? To stop him from fidgeting? To curb his fingernail-biting habits? Uraraka had no clue. Still, the four watched as Izuku kept going through the entirety of the assembly, Katsuki's arm slowly getting submerged in a sea of red of carefully traced lines and shapes, patterns and flowers blooming all along up his arm like a tattoo sleeve. Even from the distance they were at, Uraraka could see the artistic detail in Izuku's drawings, just as Katsuki patiently allowed himself to be used as a drawing pad. Eventually, Kirishima noticed what Izuku was doing to his friend, and Uraraka could see the redhead's face go from confused to incredulous as he watched his unusually explosive and touch-avoidant friend be so calm. He silently slapped Kaminari in the chest with the back of his hand, face not straying from where Izuku was actually pushing Katsuki's sleeve out of the way, and Katsuki let him, even going as far as to use his free arm to roll the edges of the short sleeve up and onto his shoulder, to allow the younger boy more access, his eyes and attention never once leaving the stage in front. They saw Kaminari turn to where Kirishima was directing him, and his eyes widened. It seemed that not a single person who was aware of what was going on wasn't in some sort of state of befuddlement. If Izuku or Katsuki noticed the reactions of the people around them, they never showed it. After a while, they had begun to tune back into what their teachers were saying on the stage, but they kept returning to the pair on the other end of the room, unable to stop themselves from checking if what they'd previously seen wasn't in fact a mass hallucination that the four of them had shared. Even after the assembly had finally ended, the massive room full of students all tried to leave at once so they could get back to class, and Katsuki and Zuko were lost in the sea of heads. They still wondered what had gone on. "Do you think Bakugou and Midoriya are enemies to lovers?" Todoroki brought up when they were walking down the packed corridor to their classroom. Uraraka almost fell flat on her face, and the others stared at him as if he were mad, which Uraraka honestly thought he might be. "What the fuck are you talking about?" she croaked between disbelieving laughter. Todoroki shrugged. "I've seen people use it online to describe fictional characters that used to hate each other, but then turned romantic, and I wondered if that would be what was going on with Bakugou and Midoriya. Maybe the hatred was more on Bakugou's side than Midoriya's, because they were definitely enemies, or at least rivals. So, rivals to lovers is a more accurate term," he added thoughtfully. "I don't think we should be talking about our classmates' personal lives behind their backs," Ida immediately said, chopping his arms. "It is incredibly disrespectful." "No, I want to talk about it," Asui said, "because Todo just implied he thought Bakugou and Midoriya were dating." "I don't see how that is a reach, considering their actions just now." Todoroki shrugged. Asui laughed again, while Uraraka's eyes widened because holy shit. "Hold on, Todo might be onto something," she said, mouth curling up in slight disbelief that she was even taking a second to credit this ridiculous theory. "Seriously?" Asui exclaimed, looking slightly disappointed in Uraraka for even daring to think such things. "You have to admit, this was weirdly intimate," she tried to defend. Todoroki nodded along next to her as they finally reached the empty classroom, taking all of their seats but still facing each other to continue their little debate. "Bakugou hates it when people go near him, let alone touch him, let alone leave physical marks on his body that won't immediately disappear. Yet we just watched Midoriya spend the good half of 5 hours drawing the entire right side of his body. And he just let it happen. He even supplied the pen. First, Midoriya looking actually relieved to see him in a crowd, choosing to sit by him, and then this? Come on." "Well, maybe he just..." Asui cut herself off, desperately trying to think of some other explanation. "Maybe they're just starting to become really good friends." Even Ida couldn't hold back his disbelieving snort. "Has there been literally any instance between those two before today that could lead you to believe that Bakugou and Midoriya could spend 5 minutes in a room together without getting into a physical fight?" Uraraka said. "Kero, have you seen anything else that could lead you to believe they're dating?" Asui pointed out, which point... "Well, Uraraka faltered, before perking right up again. "Yes, the hug we told you about after the capture the flag thing a few weeks ago." Asui narrowed her eyes, confused. "The hug? That was real? I thought you and Kiri were just fucking with us," she remarked. "No, it was real. Bakugou got sleep-deprived, and in his sleep-deprived state, he immediately went to go seek physical comfort from none other than Midoriya Zuko." Uraraka pointed a finger down on her desk, starting to get into things. "That is not a, I used to hate this guy, but now we're starting to become good friends thing. That is a, I consider this person someone I love and feel safe with, and want to be near them thing." Todoroki nodded his head frantically. "Rivals to lovers." Asui rolled her eyes. "So, why do they still act like they did when they first started at UA? If they're really soulmates..." She clasped her hands dramatically while rolling her eyes, clearly not buying it. "Like you seem to think, then why have there only been 2 incidents where they've acted even remotely friendly with each other?" Uraraka paused, and Todoroki jumped in. "Maybe they're trying to hide it," he proposed. Uraraka snapped her fingers, pointing over to him and nodding. "Exactly. Maybe they don't want anyone to know yet because it's so new, so they're just acting like that in public." "But if it's true love, then their real feelings are bound to slip sometimes. Todoroki finished, looking very satisfied. Ida and Asui look at each other, before looking back to them. For the record, I still think this conversation shouldn't have happened, Ida declared. But, Uraraka grinned, if there is any merit to what you two propose, then out of respect for our classmates, we have to keep it to ourselves. If they are hiding romantic feelings... Asui snorted at the way Ida choked out the words, as if the notion of romance was something he couldn't even compute with in his head. Then we must trust that they have reasons and allow them their privacy. I still think it's bullshit, but fair enough, Asui said, as some of their other classmates finally trickled into the room. What's bullshit? Kota said, as he and a few others took their seats. That assembly, Uraraka said easily, effectively ending the conversation as their classmates mindlessly agreed and sat in their seats. Language, however, it could have been condensed into a leaflet or 5-minute bullet point list, I have to say. Aizawa said, to their surprise as he walked in, already looking like he was done for the week. He immediately got into his sleeping bag, somehow managing to curl up in the chair behind his desk while having the bag zipped up. Some of the last ones to enter were Sero and Kirishima, who walked in side by side and looked at the class. Hey guys, Kirishima said, how long does it take for a Sharpie to come off if it gets on skin? Jiro was the one to respond, obviously not having the context that Uraraka did. Like 3 days, I think. Why? Kirishima nodded his head, taking a seat without bothering to explain. Then what Uraraka had been waiting for. Katsuki entered the classroom. He was much closer now than he had been in the auditorium, and Uraraka could see just how detailed and neat Izuku's designs had been. She hadn't, however, quite realized just the extent of how much he'd managed to draw during that time at the assembly. Katsuki's right arm was completely covered. He was only wearing a short-sleeved shirt, so they could all see the obvious red ink that looked like it had exploded onto his skin, stretching up and wrapping around the palm of his hand until it disappeared under the fabric of his uniform at the shoulder. It was somehow both messy and organized, with a spiral that soared outwards into vines, and flowers that extended into all directions. Shapes and patterns filled every gap, with tiny dots to accentuate the lines and curves that painted his skin. It reminded Uraraka of those little photos of Indian wedding henna that she'd seen online. Except instead of just the hands and wrist, it was almost the entire right side of his body. It was obvious that Izuku had moved Katsuki's uniform in order to get more drawing space, and the patterns continued as they peeked over the top of his collar, creeping up his neck. There was a small red vine that snaked up the side of his head and disappeared into his hair, with daisies and leaves dotting the side of his face. A particularly brave drawing of a slender, leafy tree blossoming on his neck, its branches daring to reach its foliage along the border of the right side of its face. Katsuki entered the room as if he wasn't a living artwork, determinedly not taking in any of the class's shock at his appearance whatsoever. Kaminari entered just after him, just staring at the blonde as he had since he'd first taken notice of Izuku's little project. Said artist entered just after Kaminari, an innocent red Sharpie held limply in one hand. Nobody said anything. Even Aizawa was staring, looking like he was wondering if he'd accidentally entered a parallel universe. Katsuki took his seat without a word, ignoring the eyes following him. Izuku shuffled over. I'm not going to be able to stop thinking about it if I don't finish it, he muttered pleadingly. Katsuki tisked, rolling his eyes. Fucking hurry up then, nerd. Quick as lightning, Izuku uncapped the pen, using his hand to push Katsuki's head up and exposing his neck. Uraraka saw multiple jaws drop as Katsuki allowed the action without a single complaint. Izuku didn't even seem to notice the reactions around him, just adding a few more dots and lines to a slightly bare place on the right side of Katsuki's neck before nodding in satisfaction and stepping back. Thanks, Kacchan, he said, pleased. Katsuki didn't answer, just stretching out his neck, and Izuku sat down at his desk as if nothing had happened. The room was silent. Aizawa stared at Katsuki. He opened his mouth as if thinking about making a comment or asking a question, before evidently deciding against it, and he turned his head to look away at the entire class instead of just those two. Without anything else to do, Aizawa stared at the class. He didn't blame his students for taking a while before they actually started paying attention. Notes: Kirishima and Kaminari. Bakugou and Midoriya's lives are like soap operas. Todoroki and Uraraka. And it's a romance soap opera. Kirishima and Kaminari. And it's a... Wait, what?